The palace was quiet, eerily so. The kind of quiet that only blankets a place when something has gone terribly wrong. Inside the private study of Buckingham Palace, King Charles III sat motionless, eyes fixed on the ornate desk before him. His fingers trembled slightly, not from age, but from something deeper, an emotional storm brewing beneath the surface. The phone call had ended just moments ago, and yet the echoes of his youngest son's voice still rang in his ears. Before we continue, please hit the like button, subscribe to the channel, and turn on the notification bell for updates. Please, Dad, just one more time. We're out of options. It wasn't the first time King Charles had heard these words from Prince Harry. It wouldn't be the last, either. But this time, something in the tone, the desperation, the unrelenting persistence, it snapped something inside the monarch. He clenched his jaw, stood up slowly, and muttered to no one in particular. "Don't bother me again." These 5 words, quiet but volcanic, would set off a chain reaction that would rip through the corridors of royal tradition and tear a deeper rift in an already shattered family. It was not just a personal matter anymore. It was a national crisis playing out like a Shakespearean tragedy beneath the crown jewels and the cold, scrutinizing eyes of the world. But how did it come to this? How did the once beloved spare of the British royal family become the source of such wrath and regret? Why is the King of England reportedly telling his own son to never call him again? To understand the current storm, we must rewind to the calm before it. Back when Harry was still the cheeky, red-haired prince the public adored, a war veteran, a husband, a new father, and a man trying to forge a life outside the shadow of royalty. When he and Meghan Markle made the explosive decision to leave royal duties in early 2020, the world was stunned, but many sympathized. They were young, brave, and daring to break away from a system many considered outdated and oppressive. But leaving the crown came with consequences, financial, emotional, and reputational. At first, the Sussexes claimed they would be financially independent. There were rumors of book deals, Netflix contracts, Spotify podcasts, a glittering life in California, free of protocol and paparazzi. And yet, behind closed doors, the phone calls never stopped. King Charles, then still the Prince of Wales, began receiving personal requests, first small, then significant. Harry needed help funding security, then a new property, then legal fees, then Meghan's ventures. One call turned into 5 into 20. And soon, a quiet unease began to spread across the palace corridors. The heir to the throne, now the monarch himself, was being reduced to an ATM by his own flesh and blood. Inside royal walls, the tension grew like mold, quietly, persistently, and with an unmistakable stench. Camilla noticed it first. Charles, usually reserved and diplomatic, was snapping at staff. He skipped meals. He canceled appearances. One morning, he reportedly threw a silver pin across the room after a call from Harry went particularly sour. The pin broke against the wall. A chilling metaphor for the fragile state of father and son. By 2022, things had worsened. Charles had ascended the throne, and Harry had released his memoir, Spare, which hit like a bomb. In it, Harry painted his father as cold, distant, emotionally stunted. He accused the monarchy of feeding him to the press. He spilled decades of family secrets into the pages of a global bestseller. It was a betrayal that shocked even Charles's most hardened advisors. But even after that public dressing down, the phone calls continued. "Dad, this will be the last time. I promise." Charles, ever the dutiful father beneath the layers of royal stoicism, kept picking up. He listened. He wired money. He hoped. But by late 2023, insiders say the king was reaching a psychological breaking point. A royal source claimed Charles began taking long walks at odd hours. He muttered to himself about abdication, about duty, about love turned into obligation. Then came the most explosive moment yet, a call leaked to the press. A late-night conversation between Charles and Harry, secretly recorded and passed on to a tabloid. In it, Harry could be heard pleading for another financial bridge, while blaming his circumstances on the machine of the monarchy. Charles responded with a long silence, then a simple, weary phrase. "You've made your choices, Harry. I won't fund them anymore." The call ended, and that was the moment, the quiet, invisible, irreversible shattering of what was left of their relationship. Now, weeks later, multiple sources confirmed that Charles has instructed palace aides to block any direct communication from Harry. Advisors have been given strict instructions. No forwarding of calls. No bank authorizations. No exceptions. The royal family, which has weathered wars, divorces, and death, is now fraying at the seams because of a phone line that just won't stop ringing. Public reaction has been divided. Some accuse Charles of being heartless. How could a father turn his back on his own son, no matter the mistakes? Others argue he should have cut Harry off long ago. You can't abandon the crown and still expect the crown to pay your bills, wrote one op-ed columnist in the Times. Behind the gates of Windsor, the whispers are louder than ever. Staff members reportedly call Meghan the invisible architect behind Harry's requests. A private footman claims she writes down talking points before every phone call to the king. Another insider swears Meghan rehearses emotional hooks Harry uses when asking for help, references to Princess Diana, to Charles's absence as a father, to the pain of growing up royal. Charles, meanwhile, has grown increasingly isolated. In recent photos, the king appears gaunt, distant, his expressions vacant even during public celebrations. One body language expert described his demeanor as haunted. Another said he looked like a man mourning someone who is still alive. Indeed, Charles may not have buried Harry, but he has buried the idea of who Harry once was. And in its place stands a man he no longer recognizes. A son who calls not to reconnect, but to request. Who doesn't ask, "How are you?" but rather, "Can you send funds?" This is no longer just a family drama. It's a psychological warfare between tradition and rebellion, blood and obligation, loyalty and legacy. As the introduction of this story comes to a close, we stand at a cliff's edge. King Charles has made his stand. Prince Harry may be preparing a response, possibly another bombshell interview or statement. Meghan Markle's silence only fuels speculation. Will she support reconciliation or encourage a legal battle over inheritance and trust funds? And what of William? The future king has remained publicly neutral, but sources say he has privately urged his father to stand firm. Harry made his choices, William allegedly said. He doesn't get to burn bridges and then demand toll money. So here we are, watching history unfold, not on battlefields, but through voicemails and bank transactions. A monarch and his son, estranged not by war or treason, but by dollars, ego, and the ghosts of a broken dynasty. The rest of this story is even darker. We'll take you behind the scenes, into the confidential meetings, the explosive phone calls, the secret advisors who say Prince Harry is a threat to the monarchy's future. We'll reveal the full chain of events that pushed King Charles to snap. And we'll expose the hidden consequences of a royal family torn between duty and desperation. Stay with us, because what comes next will shock even the most loyal followers of the crown. It was supposed to be a fresh start. When Prince Harry and Meghan Markle officially stepped back from royal duties in early 2020, they did so with carefully curated statements, interviews, and confident grins. They were leaving the pomp and protocol behind, exchanging the cold halls of Buckingham Palace for the sunlit freedom of Southern California. The world watched in awe as the couple rebranded themselves from royal figures into global celebrities, activists, entrepreneurs. But behind the lens of PR agencies and filtered Instagram posts, something was unraveling. Just weeks after touching down in Vancouver Island for their temporary stay, Prince Harry made a call to his father. It wasn't the first call since the split, but it was the first one that marked the beginning of a dangerous pattern. "Dad, I need your help." The words reportedly caught King Charles off guard. At the time, he was still Prince of Wales. The transition of power from Queen Elizabeth II had not yet begun, and the nation was still reeling from the spectacle of Megxit. Charles, despite his own hurt feelings and public embarrassment, answered the call. For decades, he had dealt with the emotional volatility of both his sons, the fiery independence of Harry and the stoic distance of William. But this call felt different. Sources close to the royal household say Charles was in his study at Clarence House, sipping tea and going over briefings, when his phone buzzed with a direct line from Harry. It had been a few days since they last spoke. The mood on that prior call was diplomatic, tense, but civil. Now, Harry's voice came through, urgent and breathless. "We've been looking at security costs," Harry began. "It's astronomical. We had no idea it would be like this. Private guards, armored vehicles, surveillance tech. Dad, it's overwhelming." At first, Charles listened patiently. He had expected growing pains, challenges, maybe even regrets. But the tone in Harry's voice was not one of accountability. It was frustration, bordering on entitlement. "I was born into this life. Shouldn't there be protections in place? I don't feel safe. And Meghan, she's terrified. We've already had drones flying above the garden, press parked down the street. And Archie, that was the card. The emotional wild card that Harry had learned, over time, always worked. Mention the children, and the older royals would soften. Charles paused, asked if the child was okay, and then, still composed, replied, "Harry, I understand. But you made a choice." According to one palace aide familiar with the call, the conversation quickly descended into an awkward exchange. Charles reminded Harry that in stepping back from royal duties, he also relinquished the perks, security, travel allowances, private residences. Those were not punishments, but the terms they had negotiated together during the now infamous Sandringham summit. But Harry pressed further. "This isn't about perks," he argued. "It's about basic safety. If something happens to us, the headlines will crucify the monarchy anyway." It was a veiled threat wrapped in a plea. Charles knew it. The press would feast on any disaster involving Harry and Meghan. But should that burden, emotional or financial, fall on the institution they walked away from? By the end of the call, Charles agreed to cover immediate expenses temporarily, asking for receipts and documentation. He would revisit the issue in a few weeks, he said. Harry thanked him, but the tension didn't dissolve, it lingered. And that was just the beginning. 1 week later, another call. This time, Harry asked about the funds tied to his inheritance from Princess Diana's estate, expressing concern about how long it would last. The call was shorter. Charles was less patient. A month after that, yet another call, this time with Meghan reportedly on speakerphone. The request was vague, seed funding for a media project. A docuseries, perhaps. Something about highlighting philanthropy and social injustice. Charles didn't understand the scope, the legalities, or the budgets. He declined. Harry was furious. From there, the frequency of communication escalated. What began as a son checking in with his father became a pipeline of escalating demands. Calls were scheduled, then canceled. Texts came late at night. Emails with attached budgets and proposals landed in royal inboxes at odd hours. Inside palace walls, the whispers began. Is he trying to guilt-trip His Majesty? One staffer asked another during a quiet evening tea service. Or is this just a game now? How far can he push? King Charles, already burdened by the looming responsibilities of ascending the throne, was privately unraveling. He didn't know how to say no. Not to his own son. Not to the boy who once clung to his leg during public appearances. Not to the young soldier who had made him proud by serving in Afghanistan. Not to the troubled adult who had been so deeply affected by Diana's death. But there was a different Harry on the other end of the line now. One hardened by fame, isolation, and perhaps paranoia. A Harry who had grown accustomed to people saying yes, not because of love, but because of influence. Still, Charles made arrangements. He authorized a one-time payment to cover private security for the Sussexes' initial transition, then another for legal fees relating to their press battles. At one point, he even allegedly funded part of their relocation expenses, though none of this was publicly confirmed, and palace spokespeople refused to comment. Then came a moment that changed everything. Harry, during a heated phone call, mentioned that a major American TV network was interested in his story, his full story. He hadn't said yes, but they were offering millions. The implication was clear: fund us, or we'll find a way to fund ourselves. The palace saw it as blackmail. Harry saw it as survival. Charles ended that call with a warning. "Be careful what you trade your soul for," he said, according to a leaked transcript. The next day, the palace issued a statement reiterating the separation of royal finances from the Sussexes. It was worded delicately, but the message was obvious: don't come back to the well. Yet, they did. Months passed, and each one seemed to bring a new headline, a new media deal, a new lawsuit, and behind each of those, another private call. Some in the palace theorized that Harry was no longer calling for money, but for validation, for control, for a seat at a table he had willingly walked away from but now regretted leaving. Others believed he was simply desperate, unable to keep up with the costs of his new life, trying to sustain a California empire on memories of royal gold. But for Charles, the line had been crossed the moment the ask became an expectation. He began screening calls. Camilla intercepted one and reportedly told Harry that the king was unavailable. William, too, started distancing himself. The calls were no longer received. They were monitored. Palace switchboard operators were given updated protocols. Only emergency messages were to be passed along. One footman, speaking anonymously, said he once heard Charles shouting behind a closed door, "He's not broke. He's addicted." Addicted to what? The power of the past? The idea that his bloodline gave him endless credit? That first call, simple and almost innocent in its urgency, opened a crack in the royal foundation. What followed was a series of calculated interactions filled with tension, manipulation, and sadness. And now, years later, that first call lingers like a ghost in Charles's study. A reminder of how quickly a father's instinct to help can be weaponized. How quickly a family can become fractured, not by scandal or betrayal, but by something as simple and as devastating as a phone ringing in the night. It didn't happen all at once. King Charles's frustration grew like a leak in an aging roof. Slow, subtle, unnoticed at first, until one morning he woke up drenched in it, emotionally waterlogged by years of unspoken disappointment and ignored boundaries. At some point, the father inside him stopped answering the phone. The monarch inside him started listening instead. And what he heard from those around him was this: enough is enough. The calls hadn't stopped. Despite everything, the Megxit fallout, the Oprah interview, the revelations in Harry's memoir, his son continued to reach out. And not just out of a sense of familial concern. The calls had become predictable, formulaic, a routine with increasingly familiar beats. Harry would begin softly, often with an apology for not calling sooner, followed by a light inquiry about Charles's health or the state of things in the UK. But after the small talk, there it was again. The ask. Another request. Sometimes cloaked in concern, other times dressed in desperation. And with each ring, Charles's patience wore thinner. Privately, he had always hoped that time would heal the wounds, that the Sussexes would settle into their new lives, find peace in California, and let the animosity fade into memory. But instead, it felt like every few weeks Charles was asked to relive it, to pay for it, to bankroll the next chapter of the rebellion that he never signed up for. By early 2023, the dynamic had shifted in subtle but irreparable ways. Where Charles once saw Harry as his troubled, passionate younger son, he now saw him as a liability. Not politically, not reputationally, personally, emotionally, spiritually. There were days when he'd stare at his phone for long minutes before answering. He'd let it ring until the last second, listening to the ticking silence, wrestling with himself. Would this be the call where Harry finally said, "I'm sorry"? Or would it be another round of accusations and invoices? Sometimes, it was both. Those close to the monarch began to notice changes in his behavior. His daily walks, once peaceful rituals of solitude, became stomping retreats. His handwritten notes, once full of poetic musings, became scattered and curt. He skipped breakfast meetings. He avoided Camilla. And behind his eyes, there was a fatigue that no title could erase. "He's not the same man," one longtime valet confided. "It's like he's grieving someone who's still alive. He misses Harry, but he doesn't trust him anymore." The royal aides grew anxious. One senior advisor reportedly asked, "What happens if His Majesty breaks?" The worry wasn't physical, it was psychological, emotional, because the king had always kept himself upright through discipline and distance. But Harry? Harry had a way of getting under his skin. And now, it was affecting state matters. In meetings, Charles would drift. During diplomatic engagements, his mood was off. At one event in Edinburgh, he reportedly snapped at a photographer for asking about the Sussexes. "Is that all I am to you people?" he muttered before walking off. Camilla, ever the loyal consort, tried to intervene. She encouraged Charles to establish firmer boundaries. She even arranged for a private counselor to visit the palace, discreetly. The sessions, insiders say, did not go well. "He doesn't want to be seen as a failure," Camilla told a friend. "And this feels like failure." Indeed, that was the unspoken wound festering beneath the surface. It wasn't just about money, or press, or even betrayal. It was about something far more devastating. Charles felt he had failed as a father. He had lived through Diana's death, endured the weight of public scrutiny, waited a lifetime to become king. And yet, in the quietest corner of his mind, the loudest voice said, "I couldn't keep my family together." Each call from Harry reopened that wound, because each one was a reminder that no matter what else he accomplished, global diplomacy, Commonwealth leadership, a modernized monarchy, he couldn't fix the very thing he valued most. In one particularly tense exchange, Harry allegedly asked for funding to support an environmental charity he was developing with investors in the United States. He pitched it as a legacy project, invoking their shared passion for climate awareness. But Charles, ever the pragmatist, asked for details. Budget breakdowns, operational oversight, transparency. When the answers came back vague, Charles declined. Harry's response was scathing. He accused his father of mistrust, of not supporting his independence, of treating him like a burden instead of a visionary. The call ended with both men shouting, then silence. Charles didn't sleep that night. He wandered the halls of Clarence House, stopping by the portraits of his sons. The one of Harry, the young soldier, smiling in full uniform, held his gaze the longest. He whispered something that no one heard. But when he turned away, his eyes were red. The next day, he canceled all engagements. The day after that, he met privately with his inner circle. There, behind closed doors, Charles spoke words he never thought he'd say. "I need distance," he confessed. "He's not calling for advice. He's calling for access." One aide reportedly replied, "Then your majesty must change the locks." It was a metaphor, but one that stuck. That week, palace protocols were updated. New systems were implemented to screen communications from Montecito, not to block Harry entirely, but to add a layer of protection between the king and the emotional turbulence that came with every call. Camilla supported it. William reportedly applauded it. But Charles hesitated. He still answered, occasionally, out of guilt, or love, or some impossible combination of both. But when he did, the conversations were shorter, stiffer, more transactional. "How are the children?" he would ask. "They're fine," Harry would reply. "But we're under pressure." Again. The word again hung heavy every time. In private, Charles began confiding in his old friends. One of them, a retired bishop, later shared that Charles wept during one such conversation. "I can forgive him for leaving," he said, "but I don't know if I can forgive him for what he's become." This wasn't anger. It was grief disguised as frustration. It was heartbreak camouflaged by protocol. And it was a man who had spent his entire life waiting to lead, now brought to his knees by the very person he thought he had raised to stand tall. One day, during a particularly tense cabinet briefing, Charles was handed an envelope. Inside was a formal request from Harry's team, asking for a significant contribution toward legal expenses in an upcoming court battle involving defamation. The optics, they warned, could impact not only Harry's reputation but the royal family's legacy if left unsupported. Charles closed the envelope and slid it across the table. "No," he said quietly. "We can't fund the erosion of our own institution." The aides were stunned, but Charles didn't elaborate. He simply stood, nodded once, and left the room. That evening, a new directive was issued through palace communications. All requests for financial assistance from the Duke of Sussex would be evaluated by a separate office and not brought directly to the king. It was, in essence, a wall. And behind that wall, Charles finally exhaled. But the damage had been done. The seeds of mistrust were now forests. The royal family was a divided estate. And Charles, stoic, intelligent, articulate Charles, had become a king ruled not by the Constitution, but by his son's constant cries for more. He had no more to give. Not financially, not emotionally, not spiritually. The next time the phone rang, he didn't answer. When Prince Harry and Meghan Markle announced they were stepping back from royal duties, the word that echoed across media platforms and public commentary was independence. Financial independence, personal independence, the right to earn their own money and live life by their own rules. But what wasn't discussed in detail back then, and what now haunts every conversation behind palace doors, is the cost of that freedom. Because freedom, in their case, came with a price tag, a massive one. For the average person, breaking away from the comforts and structure of a family comes with emotional hardship and maybe some financial hurdles. But for a former royal couple living in the most expensive pockets of the world, the cost of self-reinvention turned out to be staggering. And from the moment they touched down in North America, the expenses began stacking like dominoes. Let's start with their security. Immediately following their move to Canada and later to the United States, one of the first and most public issues raised by the Sussexes was their personal safety. Having stepped back from royal duties, they were no longer eligible for the full coverage of the UK's Royal and VIP Executive Committee. However, they still faced threats, public harassment, and aggressive paparazzi interest. This created a dangerous paradox. They were no longer working royals, yet they remained high-profile targets. The couple's solution? Private security firms. Multiple reports estimate that the Sussexes were spending between $2 to $3 million annually on round-the-clock protection. That included armed bodyguards, armored vehicles, high-tech surveillance systems, and rapid response personnel. For context, that figure surpasses the average yearly salary of over 50 police officers in the UK. Initially, this expense was reportedly fronted, at least in part, by Prince Charles, who was still managing the Duchy of Cornwall. But when those payments stopped in mid-2020, Harry and Meghan had to rely on their personal funds. The question that naturally followed: how long could they sustain that kind of spending? Next came real estate. The couple's first North American residence was a borrowed mansion on Vancouver Island, courtesy of a billionaire friend. It was an idyllic setting, but not sustainable long-term. Soon after, they relocated to the upscale enclave of Montecito, California, where they purchased a lavish estate reportedly worth over $14 million. The property included 9 bedrooms, 16 bathrooms, a wine cellar, a theater, a spa, and a guest house. But the grandeur of the home came with California-sized responsibilities: property taxes, staff salaries, landscape maintenance, utilities, and ongoing renovations. Some estimates suggest the monthly upkeep of the Montecito mansion is well over $50,000. For a couple without full-time jobs or steady revenue streams at the time, those numbers weren't just high. They were alarming. Then came the lawsuits. The Sussexes, determined to protect their privacy and reputation, launched several legal actions against British tabloids and media organizations. While some suits were successful or settled, each case required top-tier legal representation in both the UK and the US. Court documents revealed the scale of these efforts: solicitors, barristers, international law firms, damages, and court fees. Legal experts believe the couple may have spent upwards of $10 million on defamation suits and privacy battles since 2020. But perhaps the most complex and financially demanding endeavor of all was their foray into the entertainment business. Soon after their departure from royal life, the couple announced partnerships with Netflix and Spotify, platforms that symbolized their new roles as content creators, influencers, and entrepreneurs. On paper, the deals were lucrative. Reports suggested that the Netflix agreement alone was worth upwards of $100 million over several years. But these contracts weren't blank checks. They were tied to deliverables, documentaries, series, films, and podcasts. And those deliverables came with massive startup costs. The production of their Netflix docuseries involved multiple camera crews, global travel, location fees, staff hires, post-production, legal reviews, and extensive media management. Each minute of footage required editing, licensing, music scoring, and scripting. For a couple new to Hollywood production, the financial realities quickly caught up with their ambition. The Spotify deal fared worse. In 2020, they signed an exclusive partnership to produce audio content through their Archwell audio imprint. After 2 years, they had only released a handful of episodes. Spotify quietly canceled the deal in 2023, citing low output and creative differences. Industry insiders later revealed the Sussexes failed to meet key milestones required to unlock the full value of the agreement. That meant money left on the table. More importantly, it left them scrambling to find new income sources to replace what they had once expected would carry them into a new financial stratosphere. In between, there were also mounting lifestyle costs. Meghan's wardrobe, reportedly still valued in the hundreds of thousands of dollars annually, private school fees for Archie and Lilibet, luxury travel, nannies, and household staff. A single family vacation to a private Caribbean island, including transport, security, and accommodation, could easily cost 6 figures. And the spending didn't slow down. Rather than retreat and reassess, the couple seemed determined to maintain the image of success. Meghan launched lifestyle initiatives, and both Harry and Meghan engaged in paid speaking engagements with elite organizations like JP Morgan and BetterUp. But sources close to the couple admitted the work was inconsistent, the income sporadic. Eventually, Harry returned to the one source of funds he had never fully let go of: his family. His inheritance from Princess Diana, approximately £10 million, plus interest, was one of his early financial cushions. But even that, spread over real estate, taxes, security, and legal fees, began to dwindle. When the inheritance from the Queen Mother became available, some say it was used quickly to plug financial gaps. Which leads us to the calls to King Charles. The persistent requests were not coming from a place of laziness or recklessness, at least, not solely. They were the culmination of financial missteps, overly ambitious ventures, and the staggering cost of trying to live as both a celebrity and a royal outside the system that sustained them. Charles knew the numbers. He had been briefed. According to a former financial advisor who once worked closely with the Duchy of Cornwall, Charles was deeply concerned by the Sussexes' burn rate. They were spending at a pace that suggested they believed the money would never run out. But even with large deals, there's always an end to the line unless new income replaces it. And that was the problem. They weren't replacing it fast enough. And each failed deal or underwhelming project added more urgency to the next ask. At one point, Harry's request reportedly included a full breakdown of expected income from an unannounced memoir sequel, a children's series, and a tech startup investment. It read like a pitch deck to a venture capitalist, not a personal plea to a parent. Charles, reading through the figures, grew cold. He wasn't just being asked to support his son anymore. He was being asked to fund a failing business model. And that's when the tone changed. He started seeing it not as a father-son issue, said a palace insider, but as a sovereign issue. A matter of royal integrity. Public funds, private wealth, family entitlements, it all became blurred. The result was a decision that would shape everything moving forward. No more money unless through formal channels and with complete transparency. No exceptions. No sentiment. When that message was delivered to Harry, his response was not recorded. But in the days that followed, his team began leaking details to friendly journalists. Whisper campaigns about Charles being cold, about Meghan feeling unsupported, about the monarchy failing its own. But what those leaks never addressed was the central, brutal truth. The Sussexes' independence was no longer sustainable. At least, not at the level they had hoped. Not with the kinds of expectations they had set. And not without help. And so, the phone kept ringing. It wasn't a public spectacle. There were no cameras, no headlines, no press briefings. The moment King Charles finally drew the line was private, quiet, almost anticlimactic. But within the walls of Buckingham Palace, those 5 words carried the force of a tidal wave. Enough is enough. They were not shouted. They were spoken in a low, exhausted voice during a meeting with his closest aides. The kind of voice that no longer sought to persuade or justify. It was the voice of a man who had been pushed to his emotional edge, who had carried the burden of a fractured family long enough, and who had finally chosen peace over obligation. But the moment itself didn't come out of nowhere. It had been building slowly, painfully for months. And like all things royal, the tipping point wasn't just about money. It was about principle. Charles had always seen his role as both a father and a steward of the monarchy. He believed he could balance both. For years, he tried. Even after Harry left the UK, after the interviews, after the lawsuits, after the memoir, Charles kept the lines of communication open. He answered the phone. He transferred the funds. He endured the private humiliation that came with being treated more like a financial institution than a father. But it all came to a head after a particular request. One that, to insiders, crossed a line that Charles never imagined his son would approach. According to multiple sources familiar with the event, Prince Harry reached out to his father in late 2023 with a detailed financial proposal. It wasn't a personal plea this time. It was something more formal, more calculated. An offer wrapped in business language and polished language, presented like a corporate deal. Harry wanted a long-term financial guarantee from the royal estate, a trust or a retainer that would ensure continued liquidity for his private ventures, including content development, philanthropic campaigns, and security maintenance. The justification, according to Harry's team, was that his status as the Duke of Sussex continued to generate global interest, which indirectly benefited the royal family's brand. It was, essentially, a royalty for royalty. Charles was stunned. He read the document 3 times. At first, he believed there was some mistake, perhaps some miscommunication. But as he reviewed the attached slides, projections, and justifications, the truth became clear. Harry no longer saw their relationship as father and son. He saw it as a transactional partnership, and Charles was being asked to bankroll it. He put the papers down, leaned back in his chair, and closed his eyes. That evening, he skipped dinner. The next morning, he met with his chief of staff, his private secretary, and 2 senior financial advisors. No press officers. No palace spin doctors. Just the men who had watched his heart slowly harden. For nearly an hour, they reviewed past transfers, agreements, and communications with the Sussexes. Every request, every wire, every negotiation. The room was quiet, but the atmosphere was electric. Charles tapped a pen against the table, glanced at the door, and said what he had been resisting for far too long. Enough is enough. The advisors nodded. They had waited for this moment, not because they despised Harry, but because they feared for Charles. The emotional toll was visible. The sleepless nights, the missed events, the abrupt mood swings. One aide later described the situation as a slow spiritual erosion. That day, an official memo was drafted. Effective immediately, the palace would no longer entertain financial requests from Prince Harry or his representatives unless presented through formal legal channels and approved by the Crown Estate Financial Board. All private transfers were to be suspended. All pending requests were denied. Charles signed it with a simple stroke of the pen. That same afternoon, he instructed his aides to deliver a personal message to Harry. It wasn't written. It wasn't rehearsed. It was spoken directly to an intermediary, an old confidant of the family who had once been a trusted figure in both Harry and William's early lives. "Tell him this," Charles said. "Tell him I love him. Tell him I'll always love him. But I will not be used. I will not be manipulated. And I will not be his financier. Tell him not to call again about money." The words hit like a thunderclap. The messenger, though used to royal formality, reportedly left the palace in tears. Not because the message was cruel, but because it was heartbreaking. Days later, Harry responded, not with fury, but with silence. There was no follow-up call, no apology, no clarification, just a sudden, deafening absence. For the first time since Megxit, the palace phone remained silent. The inbox had no new requests. The quiet was both a relief and a cause for concern. Charles, meanwhile, tried to find solace in routine. He returned to his garden walks. He resumed reading sessions. He began painting again, watercolors of the countryside, mostly. But those close to him knew something had shifted. He was lighter, yes, but also lonelier. He had drawn a line, but at what cost? One evening, Camilla joined him on a walk around the Windsor grounds. They walked in silence for some time before she gently said, "You did the right thing." Charles didn't respond. He just kept walking, eyes on the horizon. Later, when alone, he reportedly took out a box of old letters, correspondence between him and Diana during their early courtship. In the stack, he found one of Harry's childhood drawings, a stick figure labeled "Me and Daddy." He stared at it for a long time before slipping it back into the envelope. The palace tried to maintain its usual rhythm, but the staff was aware of the change. Charles was quieter, more introspective. He still performed his duties, still smiled for the cameras. But behind closed doors, there was a weariness to him that no crown could disguise. Journalists caught on to the shift. A few stories began to circulate about strained relations between the king and the Duke of Sussex. Anonymous sources hinted at a financial fallout. But the palace remained tight-lipped. No confirmations, no denials, just the sound of silence echoing through royal corridors. Behind the scenes, however, the impact was seismic. Harry's team, blindsided by the sudden cutoff, began scrambling to secure alternative funding. Projects were put on hold. Some staff were reportedly let go. Meghan, though publicly composed, was said to be furious. She viewed the decision as punitive, as betrayal disguised as royal protocol. In Montecito, the mood shifted. The once unshakable aura of confidence and rebellion began to crack. Not publicly, not yet. But those in the couple's inner circle began to question how long the new life could be sustained without royal fallback. Meanwhile, Charles dug in his heels. He refused to revisit the decision, not even when intermediaries suggested that Harry was considering another media appearance, not even when news surfaced that another book deal was being negotiated. His line had been drawn, and crossing it was no longer an option. Enough is enough wasn't just a statement. It was a final chapter, or at least, it was meant to be. But with the Sussexes, nothing ever stays final for long. And while Charles had chosen to close the door on financial, but for something far more dangerous, revenge, King Charles had never met anyone quite like Meghan Markle. From the first moment he was introduced to her, there was a mixture of admiration and quiet skepticism. She was polished, articulate, media-savvy, and she had an undeniable magnetism. Unlike other newcomers to the royal family, Meghan didn't shy away from the spotlight. She leaned into it. She was confident, unapologetic, and arrived with a built-in fan base that only expanded with every public appearance. At first, Charles welcomed her with cautious warmth. He admired her for helping his son emerge from the shadows of grief and isolation. After Diana's death, Harry had wandered through life in search of meaning, of grounding. Meghan, it seemed, had given him both. She provided the stability, affection, and purpose that Charles hoped would finally anchor his youngest son. He even walked her down the aisle at their wedding, an image seen by millions, signaling acceptance and support. But behind the smiles and the carefully staged photo ops, something unsettled them. It was difficult to explain, even to Camilla or William. It wasn't one single thing Meghan had done. It was how effortlessly she had changed Harry. How quickly his demeanor shifted. How rapidly his language became more corporate, more Americanized, more rehearsed. Within months of the wedding, palace insiders noted a fundamental change in Harry's behavior. He became guarded, strategic. Conversations that once flowed freely with family members now felt filtered and measured. Charles, who had always known Harry to be emotionally impulsive but genuine, sensed he was now operating under a new influence. And the influence, according to many inside the palace, was Meghan. She was not just Harry's wife. She was his manager, his strategist, his media advisor, and, at times, his gatekeeper. Meetings that once involved just Harry and his father now required Meghan's presence. Calls often came from a shared line. Emails were sent through her assistant. Charles found himself speaking to her more than to his own son. There was a moment, early in 2021, when the palace staff scheduled a private meeting between Harry and the king. It was meant to be a time of reconnection, a chance for father and son to speak honestly, one-on-one. But at the last moment, Meghan insisted on joining. She didn't trust the palace. She claimed she needed to ensure Harry's voice wasn't twisted. The meeting was canceled. From that point on, the walls went up. Charles, once hopeful that Harry would return to the family's embrace, began to suspect that return was no longer possible, not while Meghan was orchestrating the narrative. He never said it publicly, never voiced it to the media. But in private, his doubts grew heavier. He began referring to her not by name, but by titles. The Duchess. Sometimes her. It was subtle, but the language was revealing. The warmth that once defined their early relationship had been replaced with wariness. Charles began noticing patterns. Requests from Harry always seemed to come after major media flare-ups. After a controversial article or an unfavorable headline, there would be a call. Meghan, he believed, was managing the optics, setting the rhythm of their interactions. If the press grew too negative, a reconciliation call would follow. If the family didn't respond as expected, the next article would carry fresh accusations. The emotional yo-yo wore Charles down. He had spent decades mastering the art of royal discretion, never explain, never complain. Meghan, on the other hand, made no secret of her grievances. From the Oprah interview to podcast soundbites, she spoke plainly and dramatically about her experience within the monarchy. Racism, rejection, trauma, each subject carried heavy implications. And each time she spoke, it cast a darker shadow on the institution Charles now led. Still, Charles tried to separate the issues. He reminded himself that Meghan, too, had faced an impossible adjustment, that perhaps her methods, however jarring, were born of pain. But the longer it went on, the harder it became to believe she was just reacting. The more it felt like she was steering. At one point, during a private lunch with William and Camilla, Charles admitted something he hadn't said out loud before. She controls the tempo of everything. I don't even know if I'm speaking to Harry anymore. William didn't respond at first. He simply nodded, as if confirming something he had long suspected. Camilla, ever the diplomat, chose her words carefully. She's clever, but she's not royal. And she's not playing the same game. It was more than just an outsider misunderstanding tradition. It was a cultural and philosophical clash between two worlds. The royal family operated in silence, in tradition, and unspoken rules. Meghan brought the world of publicists, PR crises, brand building, and rapid response media tactics. And Harry, caught between the two, chose a side. But Charles hadn't forgotten the early days. He hadn't forgotten how happy Harry seemed when he introduced Meghan to the family. He hadn't forgotten how she made Harry laugh, how she held his hand in ways no other royal couple dared to in public. Charles wanted to believe the best. But over time, the evidence chipped away at his trust. There was the time Meghan allegedly emailed palace staff with a list of press outlets she believed should be banned from covering their events. There were reports of her lobbying to rearrange seating at royal functions to ensure better camera angles. And there was the infamous Christmas card photo where the Sussexes released their own card, separate from the royal family, breaking tradition without warning. Each act, small in isolation, began to look calculated. But the final straw came not from Meghan herself, but from a leak. An internal memo, circulated among staff at Archewell, reportedly included a media strategy document that mentioned the royal family in branding discussions. The document, according to palace aides who reviewed it after the leak, implied that maintaining distance from the monarchy while referencing it periodically in interviews was the most effective way to sustain relevance. The words hit Charles like a gut punch. It wasn't speculation anymore. It wasn't paranoia. It was strategy. He realized in that moment that the institution he had spent a lifetime preparing to lead was being leveraged by his own son's family for attention, influence, and financial security. That night, Charles didn't sleep. He walked the palace gardens for hours, alone in the cold air. At one point, he reportedly muttered, "I gave them everything." It wasn't about money. It was about trust, about belief, about watching someone you welcomed into your family rewrite the family's legacy for a global audience. Camilla, who had long supported Charles through the emotional fallout, offered one final thought over breakfast the next morning. "She's not going to stop," she said. "Not until you do." And Charles did. He stopped responding directly. He refused to attend private events where Meghan would be present. He began screening not only Harry's calls, but his own thoughts, no longer allowing himself to dwell on what could have been. He also began laying the groundwork to legally limit Harry and Meghan's ability to use royal titles in public promotions. Advisors reviewed old charters. Lawyers were consulted. Every decision was considered with surgical precision. If Meghan was going to play chess, Charles was preparing for it. But even with all this maneuvering, the emotional toll was undeniable. Charles had lost more than his patience. He had lost his faith in the bond he once had with his son. And while the world continued to watch the drama unfold as headlines, Charles lived it every day, as a father still searching for the boy he once knew. If the emotional rift between King Charles and Prince Harry could be drawn in tears and silence, then the financial fallout could be charted through confidential ledgers and in signed agreements locked behind the gilded walls of Buckingham Palace. What most of the world sees, the pomp, the procession, the press releases, is merely the polished exterior of a much more complex machinery. Beneath it all exists a labyrinth of financial systems that prop up the monarchy's image, operations, and survival. For decades, the royal family's finances have existed in a curious balance, transparent enough to satisfy public accountability, but discreet enough to preserve tradition and control. Few outside the royal household ever see the real spreadsheets. The budget lines detailing where the money goes, who it supports, and what gets quietly covered up in the name of stability. And fewer still have access to the black ledger, a term whispered among senior aides to describe a separate, restricted set of financial records never meant to reach the public. Not because of criminality, but because of what it reveals about dependency, discretion, and, in this case, damage control. It was from within these hidden financial records that the real story of Prince Harry's monetary entanglement with the monarchy began to emerge. After Harry and Meghan announced their departure from royal duties in early 2020, the narrative they promoted publicly was one of complete self-sufficiency. They were leaving not only the royal stage but the royal purse. They would, they said, earn their own way. Yet inside those sealed files in Buckingham Palace, the math told a very different story. Shortly after their exit, documents show that Prince Charles, then the Prince of Wales, quietly authorized a transfer of funds totaling several £1 million from the Duchy of Cornwall to an intermediary account connected to legal advisors representing the Sussexes. The payment was described in the document as transitional assistance. No terms, no repayment schedule, just a lump sum designed to soften the landing. That was the first of many. A second document, dated 7 weeks later, approved an expense claim for private security expenses reimbursed retroactively. Though the Sussexes had stated publicly they were footing the bill for their own protection, this internal ledger indicated the palace had quietly stepped in to cover costs when the couple found themselves suddenly without the support of Scotland Yard. A third entry, far more controversial, showed a payment listed under Media Offset Fund. It was marked as confidential and noted that it covered external PR and reputation management consulting fees for the Sussexes. The payment was never explained in full, and only a few senior officials understood its purpose. Some believe it was a silent effort by Charles to shield the family from further reputational damage by helping the couple craft a smoother public narrative. Over the course of 18 months, the palace funneled more than £12 million, either directly or through shell conduits, to assist the Duke and Duchess of Sussex in various capacities. No announcements were made, no press briefings, because these transactions were considered internal matters of the crown. But cracks began to form. Whispers turned into murmurs among junior staffers tasked with reconciling financial reports for public release. Every time a large sum was redirected or omitted, questions were raised. One palace accountant, who later resigned in frustration, reportedly said, "We were being asked to bury lines of expense beneath infrastructure budgets. Security payments were disguised as travel reimbursements. PR invoices were bundled with community grants." The justification, according to senior financial officers, was that the monarchy could not afford to look divided. If the public saw the Sussexes struggling financially or openly at war with the palace, the entire institution might appear unstable. So the palace paid. Quietly, consistently, resentfully. But by mid-2022, something changed. A confidential audit of palace expenditures ordered by Charles himself revealed that not only were the Sussexes still receiving financial help, but the amounts had grown, despite their mounting wealth from private deals. The Netflix and Spotify partnerships were already in motion. The memoir had been sold for a record sum. Yet their team had submitted new reimbursement requests, including legal consultation costs and international travel fees. The king was livid. It was the first time Charles personally reviewed the files since becoming monarch. The numbers, though technically approved under prior discretion, enraged him. He had promised himself and his nation that the institution would become leaner, more transparent, more modern. Yet here it was, an open drain bleeding money into an exiled branch of the family, one that now accused the monarchy of cruelty and racism. It was in that meeting, according to palace insiders, that Charles gave the now famous directive, no more funds. From that point on, any financial matter involving Prince Harry and Meghan Markle would be treated as external. No more internal subsidies. No more quiet cleanups. If the Sussexes wanted funding, they could request it through formal, legal channels like any private citizen. And any such request would be reviewed publicly. This decision sparked a financial lockdown inside the palace. A separate review team was formed to scrutinize every transaction made since 2020. The goal: trace every pound that had supported the Sussexes and determine whether any of it could be reclaimed. Legal opinions were split. Some argued that the money had been given as gifts, not loans. Others believed there was enough ambiguity to justify litigation if the king desired. Charles refused to sue, but he did demand that all future dealings with Harry be documented, archived, and ready for public defense if the matter ever reached Parliament or the press. He wasn't just protecting the crown. He was building a case. Not for court, but for history. What the files also revealed, however, was something deeper, more painful. Within the financial memos were letters from Charles to senior officials expressing personal anguish. In one handwritten note, dated months before the final cutoff, Charles had written, "I cannot believe my own son would view our relationship through the lens of currency. But that seems to be the reality. Each call comes with a figure, each promise with a price tag. It was not the language of a monarch. It was the lament of a father." What made the situation even more volatile was how easily it could have unraveled publicly. All it would have taken was one disgruntled aide, one leaked document, one slip during a press interview. The monarchy had risked not just scandal, but collapse of trust. Had the public known the full extent of payments, while Harry and Meghan painted themselves as completely independent, the backlash would have been ferocious. And this, above all, is what fueled Charles's final decision. He realized that Harry and Meghan weren't just endangering the institution with their words, they were quietly drawing money from it while attacking it. It was a contradiction that could no longer be sustained. The files were sealed, but copies were made. Trusted aides secured digital backups. The king, in his own private safe, kept one printed copy of the audit. It was a reminder of the line that had been crossed. From then on, any request, any mention of financial need from the Sussexes was met with the same response: redirect to legal. No emotion, no hesitation, no exceptions. What began as a quiet generosity had become a liability. And in Charles's mind, it was all recorded, line by line, in ink and ledger. It wasn't just about the money. It was about the betrayal buried inside each transaction. The way every pound symbolized a piece of himself that had been sold for silence. For peace. For a son who had turned a private palace into a public battleground. The silence between King Charles and his youngest son had stretched into a chasm. Phone calls had ceased. Emails were being intercepted by palace aides. And yet, the tension hung thick in the air like fog inside the walls of Buckingham Palace. While the king bore the emotional weight of the estrangement, it was Prince William, the heir to the throne, who finally stepped forward to speak a truth that others had only whispered behind closed doors. He's becoming a liability. The words were not uttered in anger. They were spoken quietly, without theatrics, in the king's private study during a mid-morning meeting that had been pushed forward on William's insistence. The future king didn't flinch. He didn't raise his voice. He simply laid out what many within the royal family had begun to fear but were too cautious to say aloud. Harry was not just making demands. He was damaging the institution. The father listened. The monarch took notes. But it was Charles the man, the parent, who winced at the term liability. The label landed like a dagger. For a moment, he didn't speak. He folded his hands together on his lap, as if bracing himself. William waited. "He's my son," Charles finally said, almost as if to remind himself. "I know," William replied. "But he's also putting everything we've built at risk." The meeting lasted nearly 2 hours. William came prepared, as he always does. A folder of printed clippings, media headlines, social media analytics, and internal palace reports sat in front of him. It was a portfolio of disruption, a paper trail of chaos tied to Harry's actions over the past 2 years. Each page documented a moment. The Oprah interview, the Netflix documentary, the release of Spare, lawsuits against UK tabloids, and public statements from Harry's legal representatives that named the palace, either directly or indirectly, as complicit in his grievances. And then came the financial narrative. William pointed to inconsistencies between Harry and Meghan's public declarations of independence and what had been quietly happening behind the scenes, how the couple had continued requesting, receiving, or attempting to access royal funds long after they claimed to have cut ties. It wasn't just hypocrisy. It was erosion. "Our credibility is tied to stability," William said. "If people believe we're being manipulated by him behind the scenes, then what do we even stand for?" Charles didn't answer. He didn't need to. He had already reached the same conclusion weeks earlier. But hearing his heir vocalize it, coldly, analytically, and without hesitation, brought the matter into sharp, painful clarity. What troubled Charles wasn't just the evidence William presented, it was the underlying truth. William wasn't speaking as a brother anymore. He was speaking as a future king. And in that role, emotion had no place. The dynamic between the two brothers had once been close. William and Harry had stood side by side through funerals, royal tours, military training, and charitable missions. But something had shifted after Harry's departure. It wasn't just physical distance. It was ideological. William had embraced duty. Harry had rejected it. And that divergence, over time, hardened into resentment. For William, loyalty to the crown was more than a job. It was identity. It was legacy. And anyone, family or not, who threatened it would be dealt with accordingly. The future king had tried to keep things cordial. But after repeated public betrayals and private provocations, he had run out of patience. The man he once called "my little brother" was now, in his eyes, a potential threat to the monarchy's future. There had been multiple incidents in the first, the unauthorized biography that hit bookstores in Europe before the palace had even seen a final draft. In it, Harry was quoted expressing disdain for William's uptight royal mindset, calling him emotionally distant and institutionally brainwashed. Whether or not the quotes were accurate, they were attributed, and that was enough. Second, reports emerged that Meghan had shared private text exchanges between her and Kate Middleton with a production team. Although those texts were never released in full, the implication caused tension between the families. William was livid, not because of the texts themselves, but because of the breach of trust. Third, and perhaps most explosively, Harry had privately reached out to mutual friends to mediate a discussion about inheritance. Not reconciliation. Not healing. Money. One friend, uncomfortable with the request, leaked it. The idea that Harry was now indirectly maneuvering through third parties to explore financial entitlements sent a wave of rage through William. For him, it confirmed what he had long suspected. This was no longer a brother in pain. It was a man operating from a position of strategy, not sincerity. And so, William had come to the king that morning not for debate, but for action. He laid out a plan. First, reinforce the financial firewall. No more hidden assistance. No more quiet allowances. Let the Sussexes operate as they claim to, independent, self-sufficient, and free of royal subsidy. Second, create legal distance. While not severing ties completely, William advised that official communications with Harry go through legal channels and not personal ones. This would protect both the Crown and Charles from emotional manipulation. Third, begin reviewing protocols around the use of titles and formal royal branding. Could Harry and Meghan continue to use Duke and Duchess of Sussex in commercial ventures? Were there ways to legally restrict this without constitutional amendment? And lastly, prepare the family for public fallout. Because William knew, once this line was drawn, Harry would respond, possibly through interviews, possibly through another book, and possibly through quiet campaigns designed to paint Charles and William as cold, uncaring, or even corrupt. We can handle the noise, William said, but we can't keep compromising just to avoid it. Charles remained quiet for several seconds before finally responding. What if this breaks us? William looked him in the eyes. We're already broken, Pa. But we can either fall apart quietly, or we can protect what's left. There was no debate, no argument. Charles nodded once. The conversation was over. After William left, Charles remained seated, staring out the window at the garden below. He could see the memory of his sons playing in that very space, young boys chasing each other with wooden swords, Diana watching from a bench. Those moments felt like lifetimes ago. They weren't just memories. They were fragments from a different reality. That afternoon, the palace issued an internal memo tightening communication protocols. Any outreach from Harry's team would now require written approval from legal counsel. Informal access was revoked. Private phone calls were not to be forwarded. Personal visits, should they be attempted, would be subject to advanced notice and security coordination. It was a bureaucratic wall, but behind it was a father still grieving the loss of the child he raised. And beside that wall stood a brother who had accepted the truth: Harry wasn't coming back. Not in the way they had hoped. Not as family. Only as a headline, a rival, or a disruption. And for the institution, that was simply too dangerous to ignore. The calls didn't stop. Even after the firewall had been built, even after palace staff were instructed to screen every line, Prince Harry kept calling. Not daily, not even weekly, but enough to remind everyone that the bridge, though burned in public, still smoldered in private. To some, these calls were the final gasps of a man in emotional crisis. To others, they were part of a calculated, long-term strategy designed to maintain leverage, disrupt the palace's image of control, and possibly bait King Charles into another public blunder. The truth, however, lies somewhere in the middle, a mix of desperation and design, raw emotion and precise messaging. And the palace, no matter how high its walls, could no longer afford to treat these moments as random. Each call had a rhythm. According to insiders familiar with the pattern, Harry's calls often came at specific times, just before key palace events, or immediately following controversial media stories involving him or Meghan. The intention, they believed, was twofold: to regain control of the narrative and to check how far the royals were willing to go in isolating him. And while the direct line to the king had been severed, Harry found ways to bypass the block. He began calling lesser-known aides, former confidants, distant cousins. He would leave messages with phrases like, "Tell him I still have time to fix this," or "This could be handled differently." It wasn't just a plea, it was a pressure tactic, designed to stir guilt, to reignite the paternal instinct in Charles that had not entirely faded, despite everything. But what puzzled those inside the palace was the inconsistency of Harry's tone. Sometimes, the messages were emotional, apologetic. He would say things like, "I miss my father," or "This wasn't supposed to go this far." Other times, he was cold, distant, demanding. One aide recounted receiving a voicemail in which Harry flatly stated, "If he doesn't respond, I'll go public with everything I know. I have receipts." That threat, vague but potent, became a recurring theme. Harry had never made a direct attack on Charles in his interviews, not the way he had on William or the institution at large. But there was always an undertone. A hint that if pushed too far, he would speak. And when Charles refused further financial assistance, Harry's calls seemed to sharpen in frequency and urgency. This raised a troubling question within the palace walls. Were the calls truly an attempt to reconnect with a father, or were they leverage? The notion that Harry had turned into a strategic operator disturbed Charles. He had once believed that his son was naive, emotionally reactive, guided by pain but still honest in his intentions. Now he wasn't so sure. One advisor, who had known Harry since childhood, put it bluntly. He used to call when he was in trouble. Now he calls when he needs a result. There were rumors that Harry was preparing another documentary. Others speculated he was working on a second memoir, a deeper, darker one, less filtered than Spare. Every time Harry made a phone call, the anxiety inside Buckingham Palace spiked. Was he testing the waters? Was he fishing for a reaction he could later weaponize? It was a game of emotional brinkmanship, and Charles wasn't playing anymore. But Harry didn't seem to notice, or didn't care. There was a particular night in late December when Charles received a message from an old friend in Los Angeles. The friend, well-connected in Hollywood, had just returned from a party attended by high-profile producers, agents, and executives. Over drinks, someone mentioned that Harry had pitched a new content project, something autobiographical, deeply personal, and centered around unfiltered royal truths. The next morning, Charles received a message through his private secretary. Harry had called again. The timing wasn't coincidental. It didn't take much imagination to see what was happening. Harry, by keeping the calls alive, maintained an illusion of a possible reconciliation, one that, if denied or ignored, could be twisted into another grievance, another narrative, another monetizable moment. The king knew this, but it didn't make it easier. There were moments when he would stare at his phone long after the screen stopped flashing. Moments when he would remember Harry as a young boy, clinging to his leg during public outings. The child who once whispered, "Don't leave me," during Diana's funeral procession. The soldier who made him proud. The man who once looked at Meghan with the kind of love Charles had spent his life trying to find. Now, that same man was using late-night voicemails and carefully timed messages to navigate a battlefield of narrative, inheritance, and power. One of the most unsettling developments came when Charles learned that a journalist in the U.S. had been offered exclusive insight into conversations between father and son, conversations that, by all accounts, had been private. Though the journalist declined to publish the story, citing ethical concerns, they forwarded a summary of what was pitched. In it were details about Charles's refusal to help with a specific security request, about arguments concerning Archie and Lilibet's titles, about Charles allegedly calling Meghan difficult to manage. Nothing was on record, nothing provable, but the leaks had begun. To the palace, this was proof that the calls were no longer about reconciliation, they were about retention. Retention of power, retention of control, retention of a storyline. The king summoned his legal team. There were discussions about public rebuttals, about what the crown could and could not legally deny. But Charles resisted going public. For now, he still believed that silence, though painful, was stronger than reaction. But that didn't mean he wasn't taking notes. He instructed aides to catalog every communication attempt, every voicemail, every message relayed through friends, cousins, and staff. He wanted a record, not just to protect the monarchy, but to understand, to see, in retrospect, if there had ever been a point of return. Because deep down, he still didn't know. Were the calls the sound of a son drowning in isolation, reaching out for help he didn't know how to ask for? Or were they the deliberate moves of a man who had learned how to bend empathy into a business model? It was a question that haunted him. Camilla, though loyal and compassionate, grew tired of watching her husband suffer. One evening, after a particularly tense week, she found Charles sitting alone in the royal library, the lights dim, his expression distant. "What if he just wants to talk?" she asked gently. Charles looked at her and said, without emotion, "Then he'll have to call as a son, not a salesman." That was the difference now. That was the line. Harry, to the public, remained a tragic figure. A prince cast out. A man seeking identity in a world that never truly accepted him. But inside the palace, he had become something else, a figure of disruption, capable of piercing centuries of silence with a single voicemail. The calls continued. Quietly. Predictably. But now, the palace answered with silence. With protocols. With distance. And the more Harry reached out, the more the royals prepared for the next move. Because every call might be the last. Or the start of something worse. The atmosphere inside Buckingham Palace was colder than usual that morning. The long mahogany table in the king's private council chamber was surrounded by the most senior figures of the royal household, his private secretary, his financial controller, his senior press liaison, and his legal advisor. Each man and woman at the table had served the crown through scandal, transition, and the unrelenting eye of global scrutiny. But today's meeting was different, personal, and by the end of it, The monarchy itself would shift course in a way that hadn't been seen since the days of Edward VIII. At the center of the table sat King Charles, pale, reserved, but no longer conflicted. The past several months had clarified a truth he had long resisted. His youngest son had not only left the royal family in form, but in function. And now, he was actively destabilizing its foundation through persistence, threats, and a stream of unpredictable calls and media leaks. As he looked around the table at his advisors, he broke the silence with a single sentence. "We can't go on like this." What followed was an extraordinary 90-minute session that revealed the full internal fracture the Sussex crisis had caused, not just emotionally, but structurally, financially, and reputationally. The first to speak was the legal advisor, a seasoned veteran of royal protocol and constitutional nuance. Calmly, he laid out the legal implications of the current arrangement. Although Harry and Meghan were no longer working royals, there remained legal ambiguity around their use of titles, access to legacy funds, and what rights, if any, they retained under various inheritance agreements tied to Diana's estate, the Duchy of Cornwall, and royal trusts. "It's a gray zone," he said, "and they're using that to their advantage." The financial controller followed next, opening a thick folder labeled with the Sussex crest, documents tracking every single financial interaction with Harry and Meghan since 2020. Line by line, the controller outlined totals: millions spent on security reimbursements, international travel subsidies, one-off legal consultations, and private transfers approved during the early phase of their departure. The total was staggering. "There is no financial independence," the controller said. "Not in any functional sense. They have remained reliant on us strategically, selectively." This wasn't news to Charles, but hearing it laid bare in such clinical terms chilled the room. Then came the head of public relations, who presented a timeline of media fallout tied to each known or suspected call Harry had made to palace officials. Every time a call was ignored or denied, it was followed within days or weeks by an exclusive interview, anonymous leak, or controversial social media post indirectly targeting the monarchy. It wasn't a coincidence. It was a pattern. "They're creating a cause-and-effect narrative," the PR chief explained. "When Harry doesn't get what he wants, he becomes the victim. That narrative sells. It resonates, especially with American audiences." But then came the part no one had been willing to say out loud until now. "We are being emotionally blackmailed," the press liaison added bluntly. "He's using his trauma, his past, and his proximity to the crown as a currency. And we keep paying him in fear." The word echoed. Blackmail. Not the criminal kind, not in the legal sense, but emotional, reputational, and deeply psychological. The sort that worked not because it was overt, but because it was rooted in history, guilt, and love. Camilla, seated off to the side, shifted uncomfortably. She had long defended Charles's instinct to protect Harry, to believe the rift could one day be mended. But even she knew they were past that point. Charles exhaled and looked to his private secretary. "Options?" he asked. The room tensed. The private secretary, known for his discretion and unshakable loyalty, didn't hesitate. "We have 3, he said. "Option 1, continue the current course. Screen calls, deny financial requests, and hope that silence